My brother-in-law looked me dead in the eye, his arm around his new business partner's shoulder, and said it with enough conviction to make the words stick like a knife between my ribs. "Stop acting like you're a real contributor. You can't afford the event hall project." His friends laughed with him. Not just a polite chuckle either. It was the kind of laughter that comes when someone has just said something cruel, and the audience is rewarding that cruelty with their approval. I felt the sound of it hit me physically, like a slap across the face. They were standing in a loose circle, holding beer bottles, discussing the community centre expansion project that we'd all been talking about for the better part of 2 years. I was the one who'd actually drawn up the initial plans, researched the zoning requirements, met with the city council twice, attended the planning meetings. I was the one who'd been putting in the work while everyone else was still in the talking phase, but I wasn't the richest guy in that circle. That title belonged to Derek, my wife's brother, a commercial real estate investor who'd recently sold off a development and was suddenly flush with capital. He decided that made him the expert on everything, especially on something he'd just learned about through me 3 months ago. When he first told me about his interest in the project, I was actually excited. I thought it meant he believed in what I'd been working toward. I thought it meant he saw value in the vision. Instead, it turned out he just saw dollar signs and an opportunity to be in control of something. I felt the heat rise in my face, that hot flush sensation that comes right before you do something you're going to regret. My wife Sarah saw it happen too, even from across the room where she was talking to Derek's wife Michelle. She gave me that look that said, "Don't do it. Don't let him get to you. She knows me better than anyone. She knows how I react when I'm disrespected." But I was already standing up, my chair scraping back loudly enough that people turned to look. I set my beer down on the table carefully, the movement deliberate and controlled, and walked away from the group without saying anything. I headed outside into the cool evening air. It was a Friday night in October, and we were at Derek's house for what was supposed to be a casual dinner and catch-up. The kind of thing that families do to maintain connection and civility. The backyard was strung with lights, expensive landscape lighting that probably cost more than my first car, and a fire pit burning in the corner with logs that smelled like they'd been imported from somewhere special. The kind of scene that's supposed to be relaxing and comfortable. I stood at the edge of the patio, my fists clenched at my sides, my jaw tight enough that I could feel my teeth pressing together. I could hear the conversation continuing inside, Derek's laugh cutting through the glass door, that distinctive braying sound that had always irritated me but never quite like this. This was different. This wasn't just Derek being Derek. This was calculated. This was deliberate humiliation, delivered in front of an audience specifically to make a point. You're not one of us. You don't have enough money to matter. Your ideas might be interesting, but your ability to contribute is limited by your bank account. You're useful only as far as your resources extend. I thought about everything I'd done for that project. The research, spending evenings and weekends in the city planning office, going through archived documents and zoning histories. The planning, creating architectural drawings and design concepts, working with contractors to get preliminary bids. The networking, sitting down with city council members and planning board directors, explaining the vision, answering their questions, addressing their concerns. The early morning site visits, walking the property in all kinds of weather, taking measurements, taking photographs, taking notes. I thought about how I'd convinced the city planning board to look favourably on the design by presenting data about community centres and similar demographics, showing them success stories from other communities, making the case for why this would work. I thought about how I'd negotiated the initial land purchase terms that saved the community fund over $80,000 on the acquisition alone. That was real work. That was real contribution. And I thought about how Derek had waltzed in 3 weeks ago, written a check, and suddenly decided he was the project lead. Just like that. All the work I'd done became secondary. All the knowledge I'd accumulated became background noise. I stood outside for about 40 minutes, maybe longer. I wasn't really keeping track of time. My phone was in my pocket and I didn't look at it. I just stood there breathing in the October air, watching the sun set over Derek's expensive neighbourhood, with its manicured lawns and landscape beds and driveways that probably cost more per square foot than my house was worth. I felt the weight of humiliation sitting heavy on my chest like a stone, pressing down, making it hard to breathe. Then something clicked. It wasn't a moment of rage or impulse. It was something colder than that, something calculated and methodical. I stood out there until the sun had completely set, until the sky went from orange to purple to black. Then I went back inside. The party was still going, people laughing, Derek still holding court, telling some story about a deal he'd made. I made excuses to Sarah that I wasn't feeling well, that I'd taken something at dinner that wasn't agreeing with me, that we should probably head home soon. She didn't believe me, but she didn't press the issue. We left about an hour later, Derek calling out his usual insincere goodbye from the door, his hand waving dismissively like we were household staff heading out for the evening shift. I didn't say anything back, I just walked to the car. I spent that night not sleeping, instead sitting at my computer in my home office, opening files, reviewing documents, looking at the project financials with a focus I hadn't had in days. The event hall project had required a series of permits. Multiple permits, actually. Building permits, environmental permits, zoning permits, electrical permits, occupancy permits. Each one cost money. Together they added up to about $54,000. Derek, in his newfound role as project lead, had been responsible for processing these permits through the city. The money had come from his account as the primary financial contributor now, which made sense on paper. What made less sense was the way he'd been taking credit for the project in its entirety, while simultaneously dismissing my actual contributions. I found the permit documentation in my email. Derek had forwarded it to me 3 weeks ago, asking me to review the process to make sure everything was being done correctly since, after all, I knew how these things worked. He'd forwarded me the account information, the payment processing details, everything. He'd made it easy, really. Too easy in hindsight. At about 2 a.m, after Sarah had gone to bed, after the house was completely quiet, I sat there staring at my computer screen with my heart pounding in my throat. I had access to the account. It would have been simple. One transfer, a reversal of the permit payments, and Derek's whole project would grind to a halt. The permits would be cancelled pending reinstatement. The city would send notices. Everything would freeze, and Derek would be the one who had to explain why the permits that he'd personally overseen had suddenly been reversed. I didn't do it that night. I sat there for an hour, fingers hovering over the keyboard, and I didn't do it. But I thought about it. God, I thought about it. The next morning Derek called. It was Saturday around 9, and his voice on the phone had this unusual tone to it that I couldn't quite identify. Contrite, maybe, or calculated. With Derek it was always hard to tell. "Hey, we need to talk," he said. "About last night." "Okay," I said. "What about it?" There was a pause on the other end. I could picture him sitting in his office probably, or in his study with all the expensive furniture and the view of the valley. "Look, Michelle said I was being a jerk, about what I said, about you not being able to afford to contribute." I waited. I didn't respond. I just held the phone and let the silence stretch between us. "I was out of a line," he continued. "I'd had a few beers, and I was showing off in front of my partners, and I said something stupid. You know how I am." I absolutely did know how he was. Derek had always been someone who needed to be the smartest person in the room, the richest person in the room, the person making the key decisions and therefore deserving of the most respect. He'd been like that since we were kids, even when he didn't have money to back up his attitude. When he married my sister Sarah, I thought maybe success would have mellowed him out, but instead it just confirmed everything he'd always believed about himself. He'd had a bigger audience now, more people to impress, more opportunities to demonstrate his superiority. He'd just had a bigger stage for his particular brand of insecurity disguised as arrogance. "It's fine," I said. "Forget about it." "No, seriously, it's not fine. You've done a lot of work on this project, and I appreciate that. I really do. I was being territorial. New money makes people weird sometimes. You get a big check for a real estate deal and suddenly you think you're an expert at everything. It messes with your head." This was as close to a genuine apology as Derek probably ever got, and under normal circumstances I might have accepted it gracefully. I might have laughed it off and made some joke about his insecurity. We might have had coffee at some point the following week and moved past it, back to the uneasy familiarity we'd maintained for years. But something had shifted in me the night before. Something fundamental. Something I couldn't quite explain even to myself. He'd humiliated me publicly, in front of an audience that included his business partners and my wife's friends, and then he'd gone home and probably slept just fine while I sat up all night in my home office with access to his accounts, and a very good reason, a very specific and personal reason, to use that access. "I appreciate the apology," I said, "really, but we're good." After we hung up, I sat there thinking about the night before, about my fingers hovering over that keyboard, about how close I'd come to actually doing it, how I'd almost clicked that button. I'd never done anything like that before. I'd never had the kind of access to someone else's money that would allow me to do something like that before. I was a clean person, I followed the rules, I paid my taxes and didn't take things that weren't mine, and generally tried to be a good person. I'd certainly never been angry enough to consider committing financial fraud. But now I was wondering if maybe I would do it. I was wondering what would happen if I actually went through with it. Would I get caught? Would there be a way to trace it back to me? Or would the paper trail be complicated enough that Derek couldn't prove anything? Derek had apologised. That should have been enough. That should have made the humiliation go away. It should have made everything right. But it didn't. It made it worse somehow, because now I knew he was capable of feeling guilty about what he'd said, and he'd still said it anyway. He'd made a conscious choice. He'd chosen to say those words, to make that joke, to tear me down in front of an audience. The apology wasn't genuine regret. It was just damage control. It was him trying to smooth things over because his wife had probably told him he was being an arsehole. It was him trying to maintain the family peace. It wasn't him actually understanding why what he'd said was wrong. I spent the next week moving through my regular life like nothing had changed. I went to work at the architectural firm where I'd been employed for 7 years. I had meetings with clients. I reviewed designs. I came home and had dinner with Sarah. We watched television. We had a conversation about whether we needed to replace the deck furniture. Sarah wanted to get something more modern. I just nodded along. Everything appeared normal on the surface, but underneath everything, there was this current of possibility running through my thoughts like electricity. I had access. Derek had given it to me willingly because he trusted me. He'd forwarded the account details because he genuinely believed I was helpful enough, competent enough, to be involved in the financial oversight of the project. He'd included me on email chains about payment schedules and transfer authorizations. He'd made it so easy, almost too easy, like he wanted me to be able to do something like this. Or maybe he was just so confident in his own position that he never thought anyone would actually cross that line. That someone who'd known him since childhood, who was married to his sister, who sat at his dinner table and attended his house parties, would ever betray that trust in such a fundamental way. On Tuesday, I was reviewing the project documentation when I noticed something odd. The permit fee invoice had been issued, and the payment had been processed to a specific account, but there was a secondary account that the payment could have been reversed through. It was a standard business practice, really. The kind of thing that accountants build into systems as a safeguard in case mistakes happen. But it was there, a reversal option, a way to pull the money back, to make it like the transaction had never happened, or rather to make it appear that something had gone wrong. Derek's financial manner. Jeement had been sloppy in places. He'd given himself too much flexibility in the system, probably without even realizing it. He'd set up the accounts in a way that required fewer approval layers than it should have. That flexibility was sitting there like a loaded gun on a table, and I kept walking past it, and each time I did I wondered if maybe the next time I walked past it I'd actually pick it up. Would I actually have the nerve? Would I actually do something like that? My wife noticed something was wrong, even though I was trying very hard to hide it. Sarah has this way of just knowing when I'm operating on a different frequency than normal. We were in bed on Wednesday night, the lights off, and she said, "You're thinking about something bad." "I'm not," I said. "You're lying. I can tell. Your jaw does that thing." "What thing?" I said, but I already knew. I could feel my jaw clenched, my teeth pressing together. That tensing thing, where you clench your teeth. You've been doing it since Saturday. Something is eating at you. Something more than just Derek being Derek. I considered telling her about him, about the humiliation, about the fact that I had access to his accounts, and had spent the last 4 days contemplating a financial crime that would destroy the event hall project and probably damage his business reputation in a serious way. I considered telling her because I trust her, because I've always trusted her, because in our marriage we're supposed to be able to tell each other things, even when those things are dark or shameful or embarrassing. But I didn't tell her. Instead I said, "Just stressed about work. The Richardson project has some complications. The client isn't happy with the preliminary designs." "You're lying," she said. "But if you don't want to talk about it, we don't have to talk about it. Just know that I know something's wrong." She didn't believe me, but she let it go. That's the thing about being married to someone for 11 years. They know when you're lying. They can read you like a book, but sometimes they love you enough to let you keep your secrets anyway. Sometimes they respect your autonomy enough to let you make your own choices, even if those choices might be bad ones. Thursday morning came, and I woke up with a decision made. I don't remember making it. I don't remember the exact moment when I decided to actually do it, the moment when the contemplation ended and the commitment began. But somewhere between Wednesday night, when Sarah fell asleep beside me, and Thursday morning when my alarm went off, the decision had been made. I was going to reverse the permit transfer. I was going to pull the $54,000 back out of Derek's account, and I was going to let him deal with the consequences. I was going to teach him a lesson about humiliating people in front of an audience. I was going to show him that there were consequences for treating other people like they didn't matter, for using money as a weapon. I was going to make him understand that just because you have capital doesn't mean you have the right to use it to tear down people who don't. I was going to do it, and then I was going to see what happened. I was going to watch how he reacted. At work, during my lunch break, I sat in my car in the parking garage and logged into the shared account portal with trembling hands. My hands were shaking. My heart was going about twice as fast as normal. This was actually happening. This was really actually happening. I looked at the transaction history carefully. There it was, clear as day on the screen in front of me. The permit fee payment of $54,000, processed 2 weeks ago, sitting in Derek's name on the system. The reversal option was right there in the system, just waiting. One click, and the money would go back to Derek's main account. One click, and the entire event hall project would freeze. Everything would stop. Permits would be cancelled. Contractors would be notified. The whole thing would come to a halt. I hovered my mouse over the reversal button. One click. That's all it would take. Just a single click and Derek's world would change. I thought about Derek's face when he got the bank alert. I thought about him checking his account and seeing that the money was gone. I thought about him having to make calls to the city, having to explain why the permits were being cancelled by him, of all people. I thought about him having to face his business partners and admit that something had gone wrong, that his oversight had failed. I thought about him having to explain this to his wife. I thought about the humiliation that would be his now. And then I did it. I clicked the button. The transaction reversed. I watched the screen as the system processed it. The screen refreshed, and the $54,000 went back into Derek's account, and the permit payments were flagged for cancellation in red letters across the system. It was done. There was no undo button. There was no way to reverse this reversal. It was permanent. I sat there in my car for about 5 minutes after that, just breathing, just trying to process what I'd actually done. My hands were still shaking. My heart was still pounding. Then I closed the laptop and drove back to work. For the next hour, nothing happened. I attended meetings. I responded to emails. I acted like everything was completely normal. Then, at 2:45 in the afternoon, my phone buzzed. It was a text from Derek. "Call me. Now?" All caps. No punctuation. Just raw urgency. I didn't call him back right away. I waited about 10 minutes and then called him back, trying to sound confused and casual, trying to sound like I had no idea why he'd be contacting me. "Hey, what's up?" "Did you touch the permit account?" he asked. His voice was strained, tight with barely controlled panic. "No. Why? What happened?" There was a pause. "The $54,000. It's gone. The city just sent me a notice. The permits are being cancelled. The money reversed." "I don't understand what happened." I could hear the desperation in his voice. Someone who had just realised that his day had gone completely wrong, that something significant had broken, that his business deal was in serious jeopardy. "That's strange," I said. "Have you checked with the city directly? Maybe it was a processing error." "A processing error? Marcus, this is $54,000. Permits that need to be in place in 2 weeks, or we're looking at project delays, penalty clauses, everything. This isn't a processing error, this is a problem." I felt something twist in my stomach. It wasn't guilt exactly. It was something else entirely. Something darker. It was the weight of consequence finally settling on me. It was the realization that what I'd done couldn't be undone, not easily anyway, not without explanation or consequences of my own. "I'll look into it," I said. "I'll make some calls and see if I can figure out what happened." "Do that," Derek said. "And Marcus, if you know something about this, you need to tell me right now." I didn't answer. I just hung up. He called back 3 times. I didn't pick up. Instead, I I sat at my desk and waited, watching my phone light up with his name on it, his desperation coming through in the repeated calls. I felt something I hadn't expected to feel when this moment arrived. Not quite satisfaction, not quite regret either. Something in between, something complicated and dark, something that I knew would define the next chapter of my life in ways I couldn't fully predict. The permits were reversed, the money was gone, Derek's project was in crisis, and I was the only person who knew exactly what had happened and why. This was the point of no return. Everything that came next would trace back to this moment, to this decision, to this single click of a button. An hour later, Derek showed up at my house. He didn't call first. He just appeared at the door with his face twisted up in a way I'd never seen before. His knuckles were white where he was gripping his phone, and there was a kind of trembling to him that went deeper than just anger. It was the physical manifestation of someone's world coming undone, the kind of tremor that comes when the ground beneath you shifts without warning. Sarah answered the door before I could get to it, and I could see the confusion cross her face when she saw her brother standing there, looking like he'd just survived a car accident. His usually perfect hair was dishevelled. His expensive tie was loosened. There was sweat on his forehead despite the cool evening air. "Derek, what's wrong? Is Michelle okay?" she asked, her voice rising with concern. He didn't answer her. He just looked past her and found me in the kitchen. "We need to talk," he said. His voice had this edge to it that cut through the normal, Derek smoothness. The practiced businessman tone that he'd perfected over years of real estate deals and investment pitches. This was raw. This was someone who'd just had the ground shift beneath his feet and was still falling. Sarah looked at me with a question in her eyes, but I already knew what was coming. I could feel it. That electricity I'd sensed when I clicked the button was now manifesting in the trembling form of my brother-in-law standing in my entryway. I just nodded and gestured for Derek to come inside. We ended up in my home office, the door closed, the three of us standing there in the quiet space where I'd spent the previous night contemplating financial crimes. Derek pulled his phone out and showed me the screen with shaking hands. The bank alert was there in red letters, the kind of notification that banks send when something has gone fundamentally wrong. The $54,000 transfer for the permit has been reversed. He read it aloud like he couldn't quite believe the words were real, like reading them a second time might change their meaning. "I don't understand," he said. "I checked everything this morning. The money was there, the permits were processing, the city sent me confirmation. Everything was fine, and then this." He looked at me with desperation in his eyes, the kind of look that a drowning man gives to someone standing safely on shore. Like I was supposed to have the answer, like I was supposed to fix this somehow, like the world made sense and I was just going to explain how. Sarah was standing beside him looking confused and concerned, her eyes moving between her brother and me trying to figure out what was happening. "Derek, what happened? What transfer?" she asked. He explained the situation, his voice getting higher and more strained as he talked. The permits, the $54,000, the city notifying him just moments ago, the project going into absolute crisis. He was talking fast now, the words tumbling out of him without order or structure. The permits were required to start construction. The money had to be in place. The contractors were expecting a green light this week. His business partners were expecting a green light. Everything was contingent on those permits being in place. The more he talked, the more I could see the full weight of the situation settling on him like a physical thing, like gravity suddenly increasing tenfold. This wasn't just a financial problem. This was catastrophic for his credibility, for his business, sinus reputation, for everything he'd spent the last 5 years building up since he'd sold that last development and suddenly had capital to throw around. I felt Sarah's eyes on me as Derek talked. She was trying to figure out what role I might play in this, whether I could help or whether this was just some business problem that had nothing to do with me. But I could feel it between us, that current of electricity from before. She knew. She didn't know the specifics, but on some level she knew that I was involved in this somehow. Derek's humiliation had come due, and it was playing out in my home office with Sarah watching it unfold. I could see her putting the pieces together in real time, the way I'd been acting all week, the late nights at my computer, the stress I'd been carrying around like a physical weight on my shoulders, the tension between us that I couldn't quite explain away when she asked what was wrong, the fact that I'd been dismissive and distant when usually I'm pretty present with her. And now here was Derek, falling apart, describing a financial problem that was catastrophic and unexplained. A reversal that shouldn't have happened. Money that was gone. A project that was imploding. And me standing there with knowledge I wasn't sharing, with secrets I was keeping, with a responsibility I wasn't acknowledging. Sarah's face went pale as Derek continued talking. I could see the moment she realised what I'd done. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't like she gasped or said anything out loud. It was just a subtle shift in her expression, a tightening around her eyes, a kind of defeated recognition. She'd known something was wrong with me, and now she knew what it was. Derek spent the next 20 minutes trying to figure out what could have gone wrong. He was grasping at explanations, constructing theories that didn't quite hold up. System error, he said first. Maybe it was a processing error on the city's end. They reversed it by mistake. That's the most likely scenario. System error, he repeated like he was trying to convince himself. Then he pivoted. Hacking, maybe. Someone gained access to the account without authorization. The financial system is vulnerable. These things happen. People hack into accounts all the time. He was spiraling through possibilities, each one more panicked than the last, his voice getting more desperate with each theory he proposed. His mind was working overtime, trying to make sense of something that didn't make sense, trying to construct a narrative where he wasn't responsible, where this wasn't his fault. I could see him doing what people do when they're confronted with catastrophe. They rationalize, they externalize blame, they convince themselves that circumstances are responsible, that other people are responsible, that anything but their own actions led to this moment. I just stood there and listened, and I didn't correct him. I didn't tell him the truth. I didn't say, "It was me. I did this to you because you humiliated me in front of your business partners and my wife's friends, and you made me feel like nothing matters except money and status." Instead, I let him sit with the not knowing, let him experience that uncertainty and fear that comes from not understanding why something terrible has happened. There's something uniquely terrifying about not knowing why something bad occurred. It creates this space where anything could be responsible. Anyone could have done it. Your employees, your competitors, someone with a grudge. It could happen again. You can't protect yourself against something you don't understand. You can't prevent it if you don't know what caused it. That uncertainty is worse than almost any truth. Derek finally left after about an hour, still looking dazed, still trying to process what had gone wrong. He said he needed to call his partners, call the city, call his lawyer. He said he needed to try to fix this somehow, though even he seemed to understand that fixing it might not be possible. He kept saying he'd figure it out, kept saying he had contacts at the city, kept saying he could make calls and explain what had happened. He was talking faster now, the words tumbling over each other, his mind racing through scenarios and contingencies. But as he was talking, as he was laying out his plans, I could see the reality setting in. You can't fix something when you don't know what's broken. You can't explain something when you have no explanation to give. You can't convince people that you're competent when you've just demonstrated catastrophic incompetence. Derek seemed to realise this at some point during his monologue because he just kind of trailed off and stood there looking lost. He left without saying goodbye. He just walked out the door and got in his car and drove away. After he left, Sarah looked at me with that expression that said she knew I was lying about something. She didn't ask directly. She didn't demand an explanation or accuse me outright. She just said, "Whatever you did, I hope it was worth it." And then she walked up the stairs to bed. There was no anger in her voice, which somehow made it worse. There was just resignation, like she'd expected something like this from me eventually, like she'd always known I had this capacity for something dark lurking underneath, like she'd been waiting for me to prove her fears were justified. I sat alone in my office for a long time, looking at my computer screen, looking at the blank space where the account management portal had been. I'd done it. I'd actually done it. Derek had come to my house looking destroyed, looking desperate, looking like everything he'd built was crumbling around him. And I was the cause of it. I was the architect of his humiliation. This is what I'd wanted, wasn't it? This moment, this exact moment of seeing him brought low, seeing him struggle, seeing him experience the weight of powerlessness. But now that I had it, now that I was experiencing it, the satisfaction I'd expected to feel wasn't there. What I felt instead was complicated. It was vindication mixed with something darker. It was anger that hadn't been satisfied, just redirected. It was the realization that destroying Derek's project and humiliating him and putting his business in jeopardy hadn't actually made me feel better. It had just made everything worse. It had just moved the pain from being something Derek had inflicted on me to being something I'd inflicted on everyone, including myself. Over the next few days, Derek called me repeatedly. Each call was a different version of panic, each one slightly more desperate than the last. He was cycling through all of it, all the stages of crisis management. First, he wanted to know if I could help him figure out what happened, if I had any insights from my experience with city planning processes, if maybe there was something in the system that had glitched. Maybe it was a processing error that we could trace. I told him I didn't know anything. Then he wanted to know if there was some way to reverse the reversal, to get the money back, to put things back the way they were. He was asking if I could call someone at the city, if maybe there was a process for undoing something like this. He was asking if I knew someone in the banking system who could help trace the transaction. I told him I didn't know how any of that would work. Then he was asking if maybe there was some kind of conspiracy, if someone had hacked his account specifically because they wanted to sabotage him, if there was anything I knew that could help him get to the bottom of this mystery. He was starting to sound paranoid, which made sense given that someone actually had done this to him, just not for the reasons he was imagining. Each time I told him I didn't know anything. Each time I lied directly to his face. Each time I listened to the desperation in his voice and said nothing. The lie was becoming easier with each call, which bothered me more than the original crime. Sarah wasn't talking to me much during this time. She was civil, functional, but there was a distance between us that hadn't been there before. It was like we were two people inhabiting the same house, but living in entirely different emotional universes. She made dinner. We ate together in relative silence. We didn't talk about what had happened. We didn't talk about whether she knew or suspected what I'd done. We didn't talk about the fact that if Derek figured it out and went to the police, I would be facing criminal charges. We didn't talk about her role in covering for me, her complicity through silence. We just existed in this new reality where I'd crossed a line and she could sense it even if she didn't have proof. I'd put her in an impossible position. She was my wife. If I was guilty, her silence made her complicit. If she knew and didn't report it, she was technically obstructing justice. I'd created a situation where her loyalty to me was in direct conflict with the law. I'd weaponized her love against her own interests. On Friday, Derek called me again with his voice cracking. I could hear something breaking in him through the phone line. The city is threatening to cancel the entire project. If the permits aren't renewed in 2 weeks, there's going to be penalty clauses, contract breaches, everything. My partners are furious. They think I mismanaged the account. They're saying they don't have confidence in me anymore. One of them is talking about pulling his investment entirely. Do you understand what that means? That means the project dies. That means I lose millions in potential revenue. That means my reputation gets destroyed. That means everything I've been working toward for the last 5 years gets wiped out. He sounded like a man who was watching his world fall apart in real time, who was trying to hold all the pieces together and failing spectacularly. There was a tremor in his voice that suggested he hadn't slept in days. His words were running together. He was starting to sound frantic. "Marcus, I need your help," he said. "Please, if you know anything about this, if you have any information, if there's something I'm missing, I'm asking you directly now. I'm begging you, help me figure out what happened. Talk to me, please." I thought about the moments before I'd clicked that button, standing in the parking garage, my hands shaking, my heart racing, my mind cycling between certainty and doubt. I thought about how it had felt to make that decision, to cross that threshold from contemplation to action, to move from thinking about doing something to actually doing it. I thought about how Derek had spoken to me at his house, the way he'd dismissed my work and my contribution with nothing but contempt and condescension. I thought about the laughter of his friends echoing off the expensive patio furniture, that cruel braying sound that had made me feel smaller with each decibel. I thought about sitting in his backyard, the fire pit burning, the landscape lighting making everything look like a scene from a magazine, and feeling completely invisible while simultaneously being the target of ridicule. I thought about all of that, and then I said, "I'm sorry I can't help you, Derek. I really am." And I meant it in a way that was twisted and complicated. I was sorry, but not in the way he wanted me to be sorry. I wasn't sorry for what I'd done. I was sorry that I'd felt compelled to do this. Sorry that this was the only way I knew how to make him understand that what he'd done mattered, that there were consequences for humiliating people, That money and status didn't put you beyond the reach of someone who had nothing left to lose but their dignity. Derek was quiet on the other end of the line for a long time. I could hear him breathing. I could picture him wherever he was, probably in his office with the expensive view, probably staring at his computer screen the way I'd stared at mine in the parking garage. "You're saying you can't help me," he said finally. "Not that you won't. That you can't." "That's right," I said. "I wish I could, but I can't." And I hung up on him. I didn't give him the satisfaction of continuing the conversation. I just ended it. It was a small power move, a small assertion of control in a situation that had spiraled far beyond my ability to control it. Sarah overheard the conversation from the other room and came to stand in the doorway of my office. She didn't say anything at first. She just looked at me with this expression that was somewhere between disappointment and resignation, like she'd been expecting something like this and was now getting confirmation of her fears. "We need to talk," she said. But before we could get into it, before we could have whatever difficult conversation we were about to have, Derek called again. This time, there was something different in his voice. Something that sounded less like panic and more like recognition. Something that sounded like a person who'd finally put the last puzzle piece in place and understood the whole picture. "You did this," he said. It wasn't a question. It was a statement. A realization that had finally clicked into place for him after days of spiraling speculation. You reversed the transfer. You had access to the account. You knew how the system worked. You understood the mechanics of it. It was you. I didn't deny it. I didn't confirm it either. I just let the silence stretch between us on the phone line. That dead air that exists when two people are both waiting for the other one to speak. "Why?" he asked finally. "Why would you do this to me, to my career, to everything I've been building?" I thought about explaining it to him. I thought about laying out everything he'd said at his house, every moment of humiliation, every comment about my contribution not mattering, every way he'd made me feel small and insignificant and powerless in front of an audience. I thought about recounting the specific phrasing, the exact tone of voice, the way his friends had laughed, but I didn't. Instead, I said, "Because you needed to understand that you're not untouchable, Derek. Because you needed to experience what it feels like when someone uses their power to tear you down. Because I needed you to know that there are consequences for treating people like they don't matter. That's why." Derek was quiet for a long time. I could hear him breathing on the other end of the line. I could picture his face, the way the realization must be changing everything about how he understood the situation. When he finally spoke, his voice was different. Not panicked anymore, but something colder, something harder, something that sounded like someone who'd made a decision about who I was to him. "You've made a serious mistake," he said. "When this gets sorted out, when I figure out all the details, when I prove what you did, you're going to regret this more than you've regretted anything in your life." "Maybe," I said. "But at least I'll understand why it happened. That's more than I can say for you." After we hung up, Sarah was standing in the doorway still, watching me with an expression that seemed to mix pity with something harder to identify. "He's going to go after you," she said. It wasn't a question. She understood the implications perfectly. She understood that I'd just created a situation that was going to have real consequences, legal consequences potentially, professional consequences, family consequences, all of them spiraling outward from this one decision I'd made in the parking garage. "I know," I said. "I know that." She came into the office and sat down in the chair across from me, the chair where Derek had sat when he'd first come to the house looking destroyed. "I can't be part of this," she said, and there was finality in her voice. "I love you. I've always loved you. But I can't be part of covering this up or protecting you or pretending that this is okay. I need you to understand that. I need you to understand that if Derek goes to the authorities, if he figures out what you did and proves it, I can't lie for you. I won't lie for you. I won't protect you at the expense of the truth." I understood. I absolutely understood. I'd done something that had crossed a line, something that had implications far beyond just Derek and his business deal. I'd involved my wife in a crime. I'd put her in a position where she would have to decide whether to report it or stay silent. And either way, either decision she made would change something fundamental about who we were to each other. I'd made her complicit through her silence, and I'd given her no good options. "We should probably talk to a lawyer," I said. "We should probably figure out what the legal exposure is. For you, I mean. Not just for me. You should know what the consequences could be if you stay silent. You should have proper legal advice before you make any decisions." Sarah just nodded slowly. She didn't say anything else. She just stood up and left the room. I heard her go upstairs. I heard her open the bedroom closet. I heard the sounds of her packing a bag. I sat there alone in my office, the weight of what I'd done finally settling fully on my shoulders. The anger that had driven me to click that button had faded now, replaced by something more complicated, something more real, something that felt a lot like regret mixed with defiance, like I'd done the right thing and the wrong thing at the same time, and there was no way to untangle those feelings from each other anymore. The phone buzzed, a text from Derek, one sentence. "I'm talking to my lawyer tomorrow morning. We're going to find out what happened." That was it. No threats, no more pleading. Just a statement of fact, a promise of what was going to come next. I sat there in the dark of my office, and I felt the future collapsing down on me. All the consequences I'd known were coming. All the things I'd accepted when I'd clicked that button suddenly became real and immediate and unavoidable. And I sat with that reality, alone in the dark, waiting for whatever came next. The lawyer called on a Tuesday morning. His name was Richard Stratton, and he'd been practicing corporate law for 23 years. The tone in his voice when he explained the situation to me was the tone of someone who delivered bad news so many times that it had become a kind of routine, something he could do while mentally preparing for his lunch break. He didn't even seem surprised when I told him what I'd done. The short version, he said, was that Derek had reported the fraudulent reversal to the police, and they'd opened an investigation. The long version was that I was going to need representation, and I was going to need it quickly, because the evidence was apparently very straightforward. A trail that led directly back to my computer, my access to the banking system, my knowledge, deej of how the permits worked. Derek had been thorough in explaining the technical details to the investigators. He'd given them a timeline, he'd provided documentation, he'd made his case that I had the motive, the means, and the opportunity. All the classic elements of fraud. I listened to Richard explain this and I didn't interrupt. I didn't defend myself or make excuses. I just listened, and I felt something inside me shift. This was the moment when the theoretical consequences became actual ones. This was when my choices stopped being abstract and started being real. The weight of what I'd done settled on my shoulders like a physical thing, like something pressing down on my chest, making it hard to breathe. Richard asked me directly if I'd done what Derek was accusing me of. I told him, yes. Just like that. No hedging, no qualification. Yes, I did it. Yes, I reversed the transfer. Yes, I knew exactly what I was doing when I did it. Richard was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "That makes my job significantly more difficult, but it also means we need to have a strategy conversation about what comes next. I assume you want to avoid prison time." I assured him that I did. He said we'd talk more, but first I needed to understand that this was going to be expensive. His hourly rate was $400 an hour. The expert witnesses I'd probably need would be another $50,000 or $60,000. The investigators who would construct a defense that wasn't based on denying what I'd done, but rather explaining why I'd done it, why my mental state at the time might have been compromised by stress and humiliation, and a cascade of events that led me to make a decision I wouldn't normally make. And even then, even with the best defense money could buy, I was still facing criminal charges. I was still facing prosecution. I was still facing the very real possibility of conviction and incarceration. He warned me that the federal courts were handling fraud cases aggressively. There were mandatory minimum sentences now. Judges had less discretion than they used to. If I was convicted, I should expect to serve actual prison time, not probation, not a fine, not some suspended sentence that would let me walk away from this. Actual years behind bars. After we hung up, I sat in my office and I looked at my computer. The same computer I'd used to click that button. The same one that had documented my crime in digital breadcrumbs that led investigators directly to me. And I thought about how I'd believed that reversing a bank transfer was a kind of victimless crime, a way to punish Derek without actually hurting anyone who mattered. But standing here now, facing actual criminal charges, I understood how naive that thinking had been. There were no victimless crimes. There were only crimes with victims, and sometimes one of those victims ended up being yourself. The victim could be Derek, sure. The victim could be Sarah. The victim could be the justice system being forced to prosecute someone for a crime they clearly committed. And increasingly, as the reality of it sank in, The victim was looking more and more like me. Sarah was gone by that point. She'd stayed for 2 days after packing her bag, tried to have conversations about whether there was a way forward, whether this was something we could work through. But I could see in her eyes that she'd already decided. She was going through the motions of being a wife, but the real part of her, the part that loved me, had already left. On the 3rd day, she came to me and said she was moving in with her sister for a while, just until things became clearer, until we both had space to figure out what came next. I didn't argue. I didn't ask her to stay. I understood that I'd done something unforgivable, not just to Derek, but to her. I'd put her in an impossible position. I'd weaponized her loyalty against her own interests. I'd made her complicit in a crime through her silence. And now I was making her complicit in a trial, because once Derek's case went to court, she'd have to testify about what she knew and when she knew it. She'd have to admit that she'd suspected my involvement and said nothing. She'd have to sit on the witness stand and talk about how her marriage had fractured over this single decision I'd made in a parking garage. We had one conversation about it the night after the lawyer called. She came into my office and stood by the door like she was afraid to come any closer, afraid maybe that my guilt was contagious, that if she got too close she might get infected by it. "I'm going to have to testify against you," she said. "I know," I said. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." She didn't say she forgave me. She didn't say it was going to be okay. She just said, "I need you to understand that when they ask me questions under oath, I'm going to tell the truth. I'm not going to lie for you. I'm not going to protect you. I couldn't ask her to." I understood that she was in an impossible position, and I was the one who'd put her there. Sarah packed a second bag and left on a Friday morning. She didn't say goodbye. She just left a note on the kitchen counter saying she'd be in touch about next steps, whatever those might be. Her lawyer would contact mine. They'd work out the details. There was no anger in the note, which somehow made it worse. Anger would have been something I could hold on to, something I could push against. But the resignation in those words, the acceptance that everything we'd built was gone, that was harder to process than anything else could have been. And then she was gone, and I was alone in the house with nothing but the weight of what I'd done, and the knowledge that I'd done it to the one person who'd been standing beside me through everything. The trial was scheduled for 9 months later. That's what Richard told me when I asked how long I had before things came to a head. 9 months of living in this liminal space where I was charged with a crime but not yet convicted of it. 9 months of waiting. 9 months of my life on hold while the machinery of the legal system ground forward at its own pace. Derek didn't hide. I saw him around town a few times, and each time we made eye contact I could see that his humiliation had transformed into something harder, something more like hatred. His project was salvaged somehow. He found new money, new investors willing to take a chance on him. The event hall got built. I drove past the site one afternoon and saw the structure rising up against the sky, all steel and glass and promise, and I thought about how this was what my attempt at revenge had actually accomplished. It had cost me my marriage, my freedom, possibly my future, and it hadn't actually stopped Derek from succeeding. He'd bounced back. He'd found a way around the damage I'd caused him. He'd taken my best shot and recovered, which meant that I'd sacrificed everything for nothing. For a moment of satisfaction that had faded the instant I realized the consequences. Derek called me once during those 9 months. I shouldn't have answered, but I did. He said, "I'm not going to gloat. I just want you to understand that you could have come to me and we could have worked this out like adults. Instead, you chose to destroy me, and you're destroying yourself in the process. Now I'm going to destroy you with the legal system." I didn't have anything to say to that. He was right. Everything he said was absolutely right, and the fact that he could see it clearly and I couldn't, at least not when it mattered, was the most damning part of all of it. The court date came on a Tuesday morning in March. The courthouse was a grey building on a grey morning, and I walked in with Richard at my side like a man walking to his own execution. My hands were shaking. I couldn't stop them from shaking. I'd had 9 months to prepare myself for this, 9 months to accept what was coming, and still I couldn't keep my hands steady. The prosecutor laid out the case methodically. Here was the computer. Here was the access log. Here was the banking system showing my login at the exact moment the reversal was initiated. Here was Derek's testimony about our conversation and his accusations. Here was the motive, clearly established through emails and messages that showed the depth of my resentment. And here was me, sitting at the defendant's table with no real defense except the truth, which was that I'd done it, and the hope that the truth might somehow matter more than the crime. But I knew it wouldn't. The prosecutor walked the jury through the technical details, the security protocols I'd bypassed, the false authorization codes I'd generated, the careful planning that had gone into making this happen. He made it clear that this wasn't a crime of passion. This wasn't someone acting on impulse. This was premeditation. This was deliberate. This was the calculated action of someone who knew exactly what they were doing and decided to do it anyway. He showed them the timeline, the email where Derek had humiliated me, the moment I'd accessed the banking system, the moment the transfer had been reversed, the moment Derek's text had come through, key showing the bank alert. He wove it all together into a narrative where I was the villain, and the narrative was accurate, which was the hardest part. My defense lawyer tried to argue mitigating circumstances, the stress I'd been under, the public humiliation I'd suffered, the way Derek had deliberately attacked my self-worth in front of an audience, the way I'd felt powerless and diminished and like everything I contributed didn't matter. But none of that seemed to matter to the jury. The facts were too clear. The evidence was too overwhelming. Derek took the stand and talked about the moment his phone had blown up with the bank alert. He talked about the panic. He talked about how he'd known immediately that something was wrong, something deliberate, something calculated. He looked at me when he said it, held my eyes for a moment, and there was something in that look that was worse than anger. It was pity. He pitied me for what I'd done and what I'd destroyed in the process. The verdict came back after 2 days of jury deliberation. Guilty on fraud charges, guilty on unauthorized computer access, guilty on wire fraud for using electronic transfers to commit the crime, guilty, 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 each count hitting like a hammer. The sentencing was recommended as 18 months in a federal penitentiary, with restitution of the full amount plus damages. 18 months. That number hung in the air like a physical thing, like something I could reach out and touch and feel how heavy it was. 18 months of my life gone. 18 months of being locked away from the world, from Sarah, from any possibility of rebuilding what I'd destroyed. The judge looked at me when she delivered the sentence. She said something about how I'd had a choice, how I'd chosen revenge over responsibility, how I'd chosen to let my anger drive me toward a criminal act that had harmed not just Derek but everyone in his orbit, including my own wife. She said that the justice system existed to protect people from being victimized by others, and that sometimes that included protecting people from their own worst impulses. She said, "This court recognizes that the defendant has suffered some humiliation. That does not excuse what you did. If anything, it makes it more important that we hold you accountable, so that others understand that private grievances cannot be settled through crime." Sarah didn't come to the trial. She sent a message through Richard saying she wasn't ready to see me yet, that watching me be convicted was something she wasn't prepared to do. I understood. I didn't blame her. The only people in the gallery were a few journalists and Derek sitting near the back with his arms crossed, his face showing nothing. He didn't look triumphant. He didn't look vindicated. He just looked like a man who'd done what he needed to do. When the verdict came in, he didn't celebrate. He just closed his eyes for a moment and nodded, like that was what he'd expected and now things could move forward. I walked out of that courthouse with Richard, and we talked about appeals and mitigating circumstances and ways that I might be able to reduce my sentence. But we both knew that appeals were expensive and uncertain, and I was already facing financial ruin. Between the legal fees and the restitution, I had nothing left. No savings, no house, because I'd have to sell it to pay for the damages, no prospects for the future, just 18 months ahead of me and whatever came after that. Richard said, "You could have settled this differently." "I know," I said. "I know that now." The night before I had to report to the federal facility, I stood in my empty house. The furniture was gone. The pictures were off the walls. Everything had been liquidated to pay what I owed. I stood in the living room where Sarah and I had spent so many nights watching movies, cooking dinner together, building the kind of life that people dream about when they're young. I thought about how easily all of that could be destroyed, how one decision, one moment of anger, one choice to act on impulse instead of reason could erase everything. I stood in that empty room and I thought about the exact moment I decided to do what I did. I thought about standing in that parking garage with my hands shaking, thinking about Derek's words, thinking about his laughter, thinking about how humiliated Dee felt standing there while he dismissed me in front of everyone. And I thought about how in that single moment of anger and shame, I'd managed to destroy everything I'd spent a lifetime building. My marriage, my career, my freedom, my future, all of it, gone. I thought about Derek and his event hall and how he'd survived what I'd done to him. I thought about how revenge doesn't actually work the way we imagine it will. We think it'll make us feel better, make us feel powerful, make the people who hurt us understand the pain they caused us. But what it actually does is it creates an infinite loop of harm, where each action generates an equal and opposite reaction, and before long, you're the one drowning. I called Sarah the night before I had to leave. She answered on the fourth ring, and I could hear the television in the background at her sister's house. "I just wanted you to hear my voice one more time before I go," I said. She didn't say anything for a long time, then she said, "You could have just talked to him. You could have just said how you felt." "I know," I said. "I know that now." "That's 18 months too late," she said, and she hung up. The next morning, I drove myself to the federal facility in Pennsylvania. I checked in at the intake desk like I was checking into a hotel, except there was no checkout date written on my reservation, just an approximation, a best guess at when they thought I might walk back out of there again. My cell was small and cold and had bars on the window, and I lay on the bunk the first night and thought about how I'd gotten here, how a single moment of anger had led to this, how I'd had choices at every step of the way and I'd chosen wrong, how Derek was out there, probably sleeping in his nice house, probably celebrating the fact that I was finally paying for what I'd done, and how none of it mattered, because none of it changed anything. Derek had still built his hall. I was still in prison. And Sarah was still alone with a husband who destroyed everything they'd built in the name of something as meaningless as pride. The thing about prison that they don't prepare you for is the monotony of it. The days blend together, you wake up at the same time, you eat the same food, you stand in the same yard, you look at the same faces. Time doesn't move forward, it just sits there, heavy and unchanging. I had a lot of time to think. Too much time. I thought about Derek standing in my kitchen looking destroyed. I thought about Sarah's face when she realized what I'd done. I thought about the moment I'd click that button, thought about all the moments leading up to it when I could have made a different choice. There's a conversation I had with another inmate named Marcus, which was ironic because that was Derek's father's name in the case I'd read about in a magazine they had in the prison library. Marcus had been in for 12 years. He said to me one day, "You know what the worst punishment isn't? It's not the bars or the guards or the food. It's the fact that you have to live with who you are and you can't escape that." I've thought about that a lot. I still think about it. Derek sent me a newspaper clipping 6 months into my sentence. Just the announcement, the page showing the grand opening of the event hall, showing the building I'd tried to stop from being built, now standing complete and successful. He didn't include a note. He didn't need to. The message was crystal clear. He'd won. I'd lost completely. And nothing I'd done in that moment of rage had changed the trajectory of either of our lives, except to make his business more successful and mine infinitely worse. He'd turned my attempt at destruction into fuel for his vindication. That's the real ending to this story, not the reversal I thought I was orchestrating, not the lesson I thought I was teaching. Just the slow, grinding realization that revenge doesn't balance anything. It doesn't settle old debts. It only creates new ones. And if you're not careful, if you let your anger do your thinking for you, you end up paying those new debts for a very long time. Every single day of those 18 months, I thought about that moment in the parking garage. Every single day I replayed the decision I'd made, and every single day I understood a little bit more clearly that I'd been the architect of my own destruction all along. Derek just gave me the excuse to build it. When I got out, Sarah didn't come to pick me up. Richard's successor sent a car. A professional driver who didn't say much just drove me to a halfway house, where I'd spend the next 6 months under supervision. Sarah filed for divorce while I was inside. She made it simple, didn't fight me on anything, just wanted it done. She didn't want alimony or anything else. She just wanted to be free of the person I'd become, the person I'd chosen to be when I sat in that parking garage and decided to commit a crime. The papers were waiting for me at the halfway house. She'd already signed. All I had to do was sign my name. I did it the first day. Derek's event hall is thriving. It hosts conferences and weddings and corporate events. His business is more successful than it's ever been, and me? I'm rebuilding, one day at a time, working at a warehouse, making minimum wage, living in a small apartment that I share with another guy who's also trying to rebuild his life after getting out. His name is Torres. He'd done 7 years for armed robbery. He's quieter now. Prison has that effect. It takes your edges off. We don't talk much. We share space, but not conversation. Sometimes I hear him crying in his bunk late at night. I don't say anything. I just let him have his grief in private. I understand what he's been through, and he understands what I've been through, and that's enough. What Derek said to me that night on the phone was right. I chose to destroy him, and in doing so, I destroyed myself. That's the lesson. That's what I learned. That's what I spend every night thinking about in my apartment, knowing that I can't go back and undo any of it, knowing that the only choice I have now is to figure out how to live with what I've done. I see Derek sometimes around town now, not frequently, but it happens. We make eye contact and look away. There's no point in anything else. He won. I lost. The entire calculus of revenge played out exactly as it would if God had designed it to show what a terrible decision-making process I have. He didn't punish me. The legal system did that. I punished myself by deciding to break the law in the first place. That's the real kicker. That's the thing that keeps me up at night in that small apartment. I did this to myself, every bit of it.